to another exciting episode here at IT Pro TV. I'm your host, Wes Bryant, and in today's episode, we're continuing through our series in VMware. More specifically, we're focusing in on the VMware Certified Professional version 6. We're coming back at you with a part 2. Joining us in the studios is none other than Mr. Don Pezet. Don, how you doing, sir?
I'm doing great, Wes. Ready to dive right back in and do a little exam prep wrap-up for single sign-on. In the last episode, we got a chance to see how to configure single sign-on. It was really easy. We saw how to use it, to assign permissions with it, and get it in place. And so we've kind of seen everything we need to know for our practical implementation in real-life land. But on the exam, they want you to know a few odds and ends, and so that's what we're going to pick up with right here. These are things that you may or may not encounter out in the real world, but you kind of need to know they exist because you might actually be able to use them. And the first one that I want to talk about is, what if we have multiple vCenter boxes, right? I logged into one vCenter machine and I configured that single sign-on, right? I added the Practice Labs Active Directory domain to it so that it would show up, right? That's what we did in the last episode. But what if I have another vCenter box? What if I have a multi-site deployment, and so I've got vCenter boxes in 10 different locations, and I want to have single sign-on extend across all of them? Well, it's actually really easy to set that up too, but we have to remember that it's done during the installation of vCenter. When you install vCenter, it actually allows you to connect to an existing SSO environment. Let me show you that. If you watched our episode on installing vCenter, you probably saw it there, but we'll just kind of recap it here. So I'm going to take this server, and this server does not currently have vCenter installed on it, so I'm going to launch the installer like I'm going to install vCenter. All right? And when we go to install it, it's going to walk us through our standard installation steps. I've got to agree to a license agreement, and here's where it's asking about whether I have the PSC embedded or separate, right? So remember, the PSC is what's powering single sign-on. My vCenter server doesn't have to run a PSC. I could connect to an existing one. So I might have a PSC at my headquarters, and then this vCenter box is deployed somewhere else, and it's connecting to it. So if I come down here and just choose vCenter server, I'll have to provide it the details of where the PSC is, so it'll be able to connect and use it. If I go brand new, I'll have my own PSC, and that's fine too. You can have your own PSC and still join with the other environment. Why would I want more than one PSC? Well, what happens if the PSC fails? Now I can't authenticate anymore? My certificates don't work? That's not good stuff, right? So we might choose to have more than one, just make sure we get redundancy and extra balancing there. If I have 10 different locations, I don't want everybody in one location having to reach across the network to get to a PSC somewhere else if I don't have to, so I could create multiple PSCs. Or we could just have one. You can just have one PSC in multiple vCenter boxes. We normally do that if this is all in the same location, if it's all in one site. All right, now as we move forward, it's going to ask me for a system name. And, oh, my DNS isn't registered, but I'm going to ignore that for right now because that's not something I really care about. This is what I care about, is on the next screen. Now I get my vCenter single sign-on configuration. So when we did that install back in, I don't know, episode 2 or whatever it was, I created a new vCenter single sign-on domain. That's where vSphere.local was created. I could have changed its name. We could have called it lab.itpro.tv or something like that, and now it would have had that alternate name, right? But I left it at vSphere local. But the other option down here is to join an existing single sign-on domain. That means that I've already got a PSC somewhere in vCenter set up, and it's already got single sign-on configured, which is kind of the default, and I just want to connect to it. I don't want to start from scratch. I want to connect to it. And so here you can specify the fully qualified domain name for the PSC. Where is the platform services controller that I'm going to connect to, right? So this would be if it's an external PSC that I want to connect to, and the HTTPS port, which is usually 443 unless you changed it during the install, the username and password to connect. And now it's going to connect, and we've got a multi-site deployment. I've got vCenter servers in more than one location that are now sharing that single sign-on environment. So I would have, in my case, I would have the Practice Labs Active Directory domain, but I would also have the vSphere.local, that is one vSphere.local shared across each of these vCenter boxes. So even though it's called .local, it's not so local anymore. Now it's spread across each of these different machines. And then I still have my local Windows authentication that occurs. That's going to happen here too by default, but I don't necessarily need that. So during the install, we have the opportunity to set that and change it. And that's the easiest way to go about doing multi-site. All right, some of the other things that we need to talk about. We saw configuring single sign-on. That wasn't such a big deal, so we got that set up. I do want to talk about SSO policies, single sign-on policies. When I got it configured in the last episode, we added the Active Directory as a single sign-on source. It's hard to say. So we added that, but we didn't really configure or tweak any settings on it. So I do want to show you that. I'm going to go back into my vCenter environment, and I'm going to go down to Administration. And under Administration, we're going to go into Single Sign-On and Configuration. All right. Where we were working in the last episode was right here under the Identity Sources tab. But if you look at the Policies tab, you'll see that there's 3 different policies we can define as a part of SSO. There's a password policy, a lockout policy, and a token policy. All right. Each one has a specific purpose. It serves a particular role. The password policy, this is how our password expirations are going to be handled. Now, if you're doing Active Directory for your SSO, it has its own password policy, and so you probably don't care about this one at all. You can ignore it because it's being handled by Active Directory. But if you're just using the vSphere.local and you've extended it across multiple vCenter servers like I just showed you, then you need your own password policy inside of vCenter, and you can define it right here. Password must be changed every X amount of days. Users can't reuse passwords they've used before. Here it's saying the previous 5. Maximum length of 20, minimum length of 8. And then character requirements. Do I need alphabetical, numerical, uppercase, lowercase, special characters? We define that too. And these settings, these are all able to be changed if we want to edit them. My resolution's kind of low, so I have to scroll over to see the edit button. But the edit button is there, I promise you. And you can edit this, and you can set the policy to match what your company has. So maybe you've got a 60-day policy, right? No password should be used for more than 60 days. And previous passwords, we might set that to like 999. I never want somebody to be able to reuse a password. Maximum length, I might want to go more than 20 characters. Maybe we want to go 60. I can say a minimum length of 8, and then complexity requirements. Uppercase, lowercase, numeric, alphabet, special characters, however many it is that we need. Notice I've got at least 2 alphabetic characters. Maybe I want to make that 1. Well, 1 will cause me a little bit of a problem because I require an uppercase and a lowercase. That's 2, and that's why it defaults to 2 here, because you need an uppercase and a lowercase. So if somebody just does 1 letter, it's not enough because you can't have uppercase and lowercase. So you just try and find the balance for what it is that you need. And then I like this little setting down here, identical adjacent characters, because you'll have where people just say like 1111, and this will stop them from doing that. You won't be able to use the same one over and over and over again, so you can set a limit. The default is 3, you can make it lower or higher. All right. Once that's defined, we'll now have a password policy that's set, and that's applying to the accounts right here inside of SSO. So when we start creating accounts in vSphere.local and somebody logs in and their password is expired, it'll force them to change it. And when they change it, it'll have to meet these complexity requirements. That's pretty standard password policy stuff there, probably not earth-shattering for you guys. All right, the next policy is the lockout policy. And this one's really important because it can help prevent brute force attacks. Remember that the vCenter environment, it uses a web client. And so anybody can fire up a web browser and point it at your vCenter server. Now, we can use the firewall to restrict who's allowed to get to it. We'll talk about that in the hardening episodes. But if I want it open to my network team and somebody manages to get on my network team's network, well, now they could brute force. They could just try and guess a password. Most people know that a vSphere environment is going to have an administrator account. And as long as they know the domain, which is probably vSphere.local, then they can log in as administrator at vSphere.local. Now they just have to guess a password, right? So they can go in and try and guess that password. If they know that SSO is configured, then they might know that it's your email address you log in with. So they can try that and start just guessing passwords over and over again. So we can set a lockout that says, after a certain amount of failed attempts, lock the account, right? The default is after 5 failed attempts within 3 minutes, we're going to lock them out. And it's going to keep them locked for 5 minutes. I might want to change that around a little bit, right? So 5 failed attempts in 3 minutes, that might be not aggressive enough for me, right? Because now what I'm really doing is if somebody's trying to brute force, I'm holding them to 5 attempts every 3 minutes. Well, then they get flagged and another 5 minutes goes by. So it's really 5 attempts every 8 minutes. Right? So every 8 minutes, somebody can try 5 passwords. Well, if there are millions of combinations of passwords, it's probably more than millions, it would take a long, long time for them to guess. And this is a pretty effective policy. I might want to be more aggressive or less aggressive based on just kind of my users. If I find the users are constantly screwing up their password, maybe I need to hire better users, or maybe I need to loosen this policy a little bit. And just like the other one, it's off my screen. I'm going to minimize the alarms panel and the work in progress panel so that I can see it. There's my edit button, and now I can edit that, and I can go and tweak those values. And you can set it to seconds, minutes, hours, days, whatever it is that you want, and you can put that in place.
Don, is there any benefit to increasing, the amount of attempts there? And when I say that, it's always going to make it more secure, but in relation to like some kind of brute force software, because as you've said, you increase those lockouts and or decrease the attempts, I guess you should say, and you burden your users. Is there really a benefit?
You got to find the sweet spot,
okay.
right? The balance. So have you ever forgotten your password?
Oh, yes.
Or you go to a site and you're like, I'm pretty sure the password was this, and you try a few combinations. How many combinations do you have to try before you remember what it was? It might be 5 or 6 combinations, right? So if it's 5 or 6 and I do it in a 3-minute period, I hit this policy. Well, if somebody's brute forcing us, they're usually using software to do it, and they'll probably be trying thousands of times per second even in some cases. So I could probably loosen this a little bit more and still be perfectly safe. You just have to find that balance. It's what's acceptable to your users and what's acceptable to the security team, because the security team is going to have a lot of feedback on this one, right? They want it to be not too lax, because then brute force becomes possible. All right, so just kind of figuring out what works for you. The last one is the one you're least likely to mess with, and that's the token policy. Token policies, basically when you authenticate, you're given a token. And your token is only good for a certain period of time before you have to authenticate again. So you log in, you start to work. Now, if you idle and walk away, then that token starts aging. And maybe it's the end of the day and you leave the office and you left yourself logged into vCenter. When you come back in the morning, is that token still good? If it is, in theory, somebody else could sit at your computer and start using the system. Or somebody could have intercepted your token on the network and be replaying it. But the tokens expire. And when they expire, you have to re-authenticate. So if somebody intercepted your token, they wouldn't be able to use it after it expired. Or if you left yourself logged in, you'd effectively be logged out because your token wouldn't be valid anymore. So we can set what that lifetime is. And you'll see the maximum bearer token lifetime right now is set to 5 minutes. Every 5 minutes, I've got to interact with the system. And if I don't, then it's going to effectively log me out. It doesn't actually log you out, it just expires your token. So you'll still be in vCenter, but the next time you try and perform an action, it's going to fail, or you're going to re-authenticate, one of the two. It'll usually just send you back to the login page. You can also set things like the maximum token renewal count. If I stay online, I can renew my token up to 10 times as the default. If we require a lifetime of 5 minutes and I can renew up to 10 times, that means I can work in vCenter for 50 minutes before I have to authenticate again. All right. Well, that's not a terribly long time. I might want to extend that. Or maybe that's too long in my book and I want to shorten it based on the needs of my company. You've got the maximum token delegation count. How many times can I open up different windows and tabs and start having different systems all using that same token before it runs out? These are all different things that we can tweak. And the default values are pretty stable. We don't normally mess with them. The only one that really comes into play in most environments is this guy right here, that the tokens have a clock tolerance of 600,000 milliseconds, right? Or 600 seconds, or what is that, 1 hour? No. What is it? 600 seconds is 60 minutes, which is 60 minutes is an hour, right? So I guess that's 1 hour. So it's 1 hour. Well, what that means is that somebody could be authenticating and their computer clock could be off by up to an hour and the token is still considered valid. The problem there is a hacker could intercept a token or even intercept an entire authentication packet and replay it. And as long as they do it within an hour, we'll accept it. That may be too lenient. I might want to make that more aggressive to stop replay attacks. Now, normally we do encryption on the network so they can't get that token packet in the first place, so it doesn't matter, right? But you might want to make this more aggressive or more lenient. If you have bad time synchronization across your company, then you might need to do that. But for the most part, the token policy we just leave alone. And so, but it is there. These are all different things that we can tweak on a single sign-on. Let's see, what else do we have? Quick word on upgrades, right? Upgrading with single sign-on can be a little bit tricky. I'm running vSphere 6, right? Maybe I was running vSphere 5.5 before, or even vSphere 5.0. Or maybe vSphere 6.5 comes out, and it's time to upgrade, right? How do we handle upgrades under vSphere? Well, upgrades need to be followed in a very particular pattern, all right? You always need to upgrade vCenter and the PSC together if they're together, or separate if they're separate. But you need to upgrade vCenter first. Always upgrade vCenter first. So if you're at vCenter 6 and vCenter or vSphere 6.5 comes out, so I want to upgrade vCenter to vCenter 6.5, I'm going to upgrade it first. Pop in the disk, run through the upgrade process. I'm going to upgrade the PSC also. And so you'll normally upgrade vCenter first and then the PSC if they're separate. If they're together, they get upgraded at the same time. It's no big deal. But vCenter should always be first. And your ESXi hosts should be last, right? Always upgrade your ESXi hosts last. Because what happens is, we'll use the old example of 5 and 5.5, is that vCenter 5.5 could manage ESX5 hosts, and it could manage ESX 5.5 hosts. But vCenter 5 could not manage ESX 5.5 hosts, right? So vCenter needs to be upgraded first because it'll be able to handle everybody else from there. ESXi hosts need to be upgraded last. So always remember that because that impacts single sign-on. If I upgrade my hosts first, now they can't talk to vCenter and they can't talk to the PSC, which means now I can't authenticate, and now I've effectively broken single sign-on. That's bad. We don't want that, right? You always want your single sign-on to work, otherwise you get locked out and you have a resume generating event, right, an RGE. So you don't want that. You want to make sure you upgrade vCenter first, then the PSC, or together if they're together, and then last the ESXi hosts. All right, the only other thing I have is an exam objective they call out that is something I absolutely don't use in production, is that a lot of people don't know this, but vCenter is running on top of Windows in my environment, and I've got Windows joined to the domain. And so I've got a domain joined computer that's running vCenter, so it's in the Active Directory. I've got all my ESXi hosts too, but those ESXi hosts, they're Linux machines, and they're not joined to the Active Directory. They don't show up in the Active Directory, and I'm fine with that because I don't care, right? Because they're Linux hosts. I don't need them in the Active Directory. But some people really want those ESXi hosts to show up in the Active Directory, and the main reason is if you do, you can log in even if your PSC goes offline. The ESXi host can still talk to a domain controller to log in. So if you want that functionality, you can join your ESXi hosts to an Active Directory domain. And they'll show up with a computer account in the Active Directory, and you'll be able to log in even in the event that the vCenter server fails. Now, if the vCenter server fails, you need to get it back online as soon as you can, because that's kind of the heart of your management environment. But while it's offline, at least you'd still be able to manage VMs a little bit, start them up, shut them down, and things like that, because you'd be able to log into the hosts. All right. So we can get them joined. Let me show you how that works. It's actually not very hard, although I don't know if this environment's set up to do it right, so I might get an error, but we'll see. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to get one joined, and I'm going to jump up to my home, and I'm going to go down to hosts and clusters. This is done on the host itself. So when I go into the host, I'm going to go over here to manage, and we can start to configure all of our various settings right inside of the host. Now, the things that I want to get set up in here are going to be under the host, under manage, and then we're going to go into our settings, which are all kind of buried right over here. And in our settings, we're looking for system and authentication services, which are right here. Okay, under authentication services, you'll see where you're authenticating, and by default, it's set to local authentication. And local authentication is attached to vCenter. So in my case, that's the vSphere.local SSO domain, as well as local accounts on this ESXi host. All right? But see how you've got domain settings? It can actually be tied to an Active Directory domain, and you've got trusted domain controllers. So it does support being connected, and you've got a nice big join domain button right here to get it connected. All right? Couple of things that need to be set up beforehand. First off, my system clock. The Active Directory uses Kerberos for authentication, and Microsoft only allows a 5-minute offset. We saw an hour offset a minute ago inside of VMware, but Microsoft is 5 minutes, so really short offset time for your clock. So I probably need to go to time configuration and make sure that I'm syncing my time. See how my NTP client is disabled? So I'm not really syncing my time, am I? But I can edit that, and I can synchronize my time against an external NTP server. Or what I like to do is synchronize against the domain controller. How better to make sure your time is synchronized with the domain controller than to actually sync from the domain controller itself? Every Microsoft domain controller is a time server. They've got that functionality there. In the Microsoft world, I know this isn't a Microsoft show, but there's a domain controller that's called the PDC emulator. And the PDC emulator is a root time source. It's considered a Stratum 1 time source for your machines. And we don't need to know all that, but we just need to know that you can point at the domain controller and you can sync your time from it, and that way you know you'll have it set right. So I can come in here and specify an NTP server, and I can put in whatever my domain controller is. All right. I actually don't know the IP of my domain controller. Let me go figure that out real quick. So I've got this domain controller here, plab DC01, and it's 192.168.0.1. That's its IP. So I'm going to set my time to synchronize against that, 192.168.0.1. And if it's not available, I could always specify an alternate and do something like pool.ntp.org and tie to some external one. But I'll just point to that DC. All right. And then I'll set the time client to start and stop with the host. So whenever the host boots up, it's going to start the time client, and I'll go ahead and start it. Okay, so now that host, that ESXi host, is going to start synchronizing its time with the domain controller. And we probably want to do the same thing with vCenter. We saw that in an earlier episode. We want to make sure that we have all of our stuff kind of synchronized. In my case, vCenter is running on top of Windows, and Windows is joined to the domain, so I'm already synchronizing my clock properly, so I don't have to worry about the clock on the vCenter server itself. All right, then you've got your networking tab up here, and under networking, you can set your TCP/IP configuration. And under TCP/IP, here's where you can tweak things like who your DNS servers are and your default gateway. And the reason I bring this up is if you look at my host, the IPv4 gateway address is set, but my preferred DNS server is not. I can't do name lookups. Now, Active Directory can work with DNS lookups, and it can work with NetBIOS broadcasts. That NetBIOS stuff will work if my ESXi hosts are on the same network as my domain controller. But if they're separate, my ESXi host needs to be able to do DNS lookups to find it because the broadcast won't work. I need DNS servers, and I don't have any right now. So I need to edit that and set some DNS servers for this to be able to communicate. I'm glad I thought to check this because if I hadn't, it would have failed to join. So I'm going to come in here and manually enter in a preferred DNS server, and I'm going to put in that domain controller. When you run the Active Directory, you always run an internal DNS server because you need all those Active Directory records, and so I'm putting those in here. I can set my domain, which I also don't remember from earlier. Let's go find that. I think it was called practicelabs.com. Yeah, practicelabs.com. So I'm going to go back to my machine here and I'll add it. So we'll call it practice. There we go, practicelabs.com. And my host name is localhost. I can leave it that way or I can change it. In vCenter, I'm calling this plab ESX01. So I can always rename it like that, so I'll recognize it a little better. I don't want a bunch of machines in the Active Directory called localhost. That's not going to help me. So I can set those, and I can even make practicelabs.com a search domain if I want. I don't have to do that, but I'll set it. Okay, so now that I've got that in place, I'll hit the OK button, and now my time is synchronized and my DNS lookup should be working. I'll use my IT operative there of should. It hasn't refreshed. My preferred DNS isn't showing up. My task shows as completed. Let me just refresh the screen and make sure sometimes the screen doesn't refresh and the setting actually did apply. Yeah, that's what it was here. That setting did apply, it just wasn't showing up until I hit refresh. Remember, you've always got that refresh button up there. It's kind of like getting a second opinion from a doctor. If you don't like the first thing you hear, just hit refresh. All right, so now I should be able to join the domain. Assuming I've got connectivity and all that other good stuff. So I'm going to go over here to settings, back down to authentication services, and I'm going to hit that big shiny join domain button that's been tempting me this whole time. And now we need to provide some basic information. What's the domain called? Mine is practicelabs.com. And then what's a user account? That's something I probably should have looked up before the show, but I'll assume that the administrator account will work just fine. Technically, any user account in the Active Directory is capable of adding a machine to the AD. What Microsoft doesn't advertise all that heavily is that every user account can do it 10 times. So once you've added 10 machines, you hit your limit. So I don't have to have an admin account. I could use a regular account. But once I added my 10th host, the 11th one would fail. Right? You can modify that. Some people modify it to bump that number up. If you use an administrator, though, they can add an unlimited amount of accounts. So that's why I'm using the administrator account. And what I should have looked up before the show was what its password is. I think I know it. We'll see if that works for us. So that's going to reach out. It's going to try and find the domain controller, and it's going to join it. And I can see that task running right down here, and I got cannot complete login. And if I pull up that message, I got a notification for it. And the notification's buried down here. let me get it out here. Cannot complete login due to an incorrect username or password. So I need a valid username and password on the domain to be able to do it. So I guess I can go whip one up real quick, and then we'll get it joined. So once that's joined, now we'll be attached to the domain.
You know, Don, what I think is interesting is when you verified your password, it took 2 minutes, but boy, when you type it wrong, it verified it right away.
Well, that was the certificate services, which is a part of the PSC. This is technically part of the ESXi host, and that stuff runs fast. That certificate service, I'm not joking. That is a pain. So I'm going to whip up a new user account real quick just so that I actually know it. I'll create an account for myself. So I'm going to create a Don Pizzette account. So I'll just be dpizzette@practicelabs.com, and I'll know my password, because that is always handy when working with an account, is to know what your password actually is. So I'll get that set, and I'm just going to add myself to administrators. I don't technically need to be administrators just to join in a machine, but I don't know, I feel special. I want to be a domain admin. So I'm going to add it in, domain admins, and we'll get that set. Oh, you know, while I'm in here, let me mention something. In the Active Directory, once the ESX hosts are joined, in the Active Directory, if you create a group called ESX admins, it doesn't exist by default. You have to make it. If you make a group called ESX admins, anybody you put in that group will automatically be an administrator on your ESX hosts, on every ESX host in your entire environment. The group doesn't exist, but vSphere looks for it. So every time an ESX host authenticates against the Active Directory, it looks to see if a group called ESX admins exists. And if it does, anybody in that group is allowed to be an administrator on that ESX host. So if I want to get this up and going quick and make these people administrators, I can set that up. So I'm creating an account for myself here, and I'm making me a domain admin. But while I'm in here, I'm going to make another group. So I'll just do a new group. And when I create that group, I'm going to call it ESX admins, and the name is very specific. It's got to be ESX space admins. It's not case sensitive, but in all the documentation they show ESX capital and the A capital. But what's important is that it's ESX space admins. All right, and if you create a group with that name, then you'll be able to authenticate. It'll actually work whether it's domain local, global, or universal. I typically do a universal on these, but global is the one that you normally need. So I'll go ahead and create that, and I can put myself in that too. That way I'll be an admin on these accounts. So if I come in, find myself, I'm on a soul searching expedition here to find myself. Apparently I'm not going to find myself. Somewhere in this list I will find my account. There I am. And I'm going to add myself to that ESX admins group. So kind of a neat thing. It's not very well documented out there on the internet, but it is in VMware's documentation. They show that ESX admins group. There we go. All right. So now that I've got that, let's go back and try and rejoin this client that failed for me. So I'm going to rejoin. I'm going to put in practicelabs.com. I'm going to use my user account that should actually work this time. Although I've rambled on long enough, I might have forgot my own password. And we'll give that another shot. Okay, so it's going to reach out in the background. There we go. Now I get a nice big green check mark completed, and I show that it's tied to practicelabs.com, right? It's tied to that domain. Now I tied to the Active Directory, so I don't have any trusted domain controllers listed. If I had tied to like a open LDAP environment or a Samba environment, then I would have to specify domain controllers, and they would show up here as trusted domain controllers. But when it's just the regular Active Directory, all the domain controllers are trusted, so they don't get listed here. But I'm now connected. I've got Directory Services Configuration Active Directory, and I'm tied into it. And so now we can authenticate on the ESXi host as an Active Directory account, even if the PSC is offline. With the PSC, I connected that to Active Directory, right? We set up single sign-on, so I could already log in with the accounts, assuming the PSC was up. If it goes down, now I got a problem, but now I'm covered. I can log into the host even if the PSC goes down. So a nice backup plan.
Don, we appreciate that. Thank you for showing us how to join that to Active Directory. Looking at the clock, though, it does look like we're coming to the end of another episode, but before we do you have any additional words?
That's about it for single sign-on. You guys see, it's pretty simple, just kind of knowing where the options are. We are going to visit authentication a little more in our hardening episode. We're going to talk about hardening vCenter, hardening ESXi, hardening, what's the other thing? vCenter, ESXi, and the virtual machines. So we'll talk about hardening those. And so we'll dabble in some of these settings again later on. But these are the main ones we need to know about SSO and kind of what's on the exam. You don't have to use all the features we talked about. You don't have to use SSO at all, really. You can use all local accounts if you want. It just makes life harder. So pick and choose the pieces from that sounded good, use those in your environment, and it'll work out really well.
Don, thank you for joining us in the studios again, and thank you to the viewers for watching. Signing out for IT Pro TV, I've been your host, Wes Bryan.
And I'm Don Pizzette.
And we'll see you next time.